everyone. Welcome back to episode 8 of Guatemala Life and Culture. It's part 2 of immigration. So in our last episode, if you missed it, we encourage you to go back and listen to the first half of our talk about immigration. So today we will be continuing the conversation and wrapping immigration up.
Yes.
All right. So when we left off, we were talking about this made-up guy named Julio, and he ended up coming with a coyote to the United States and arrived at the border. And we touched upon, different types of visas or what the process looks like. And today we're going to continue to talk about Julio and his journey, but we're also going to kind of dive into the unaccompanied minors that we referenced. Yeah. Again, an unaccompanied minor is anybody who comes to the United States under the age of 18 without a legal custodian with them, guardian with them.
Yeah.
And so for those of you watching, there's graphics on the screen here that kind of help tell this journey. Again, if you're listening, the link will be on the podcast for you to be able to check those visuals out at a later time. But so an unaccompanied minor, when they're coming to the USA, what does that look like? How does that work? Well, what happens is they're fleeing violence or they're fleeing extreme poverty, and their goal is to reach the United States, and their goal is to be caught at the border.
Yes.
For the unaccompanied minors, again, I think a lot of people out there think that everyone coming to the border is trying to not get caught. And certainly that is the case for the people that want to do bad things.
Right.
People that are smuggling in your drugs, any other bad things that you can think of. Those are the people that don't want to get caught.
Those are the people crossing the river, the desert.
Yeah, maybe no identification.
Trying not to be detected. Yes. Mm-hmm.
But our families who do, in our community, again, not all of our families come this way. We're just talking about the ones that do. They're wanting to get caught. They've got nothing to hide. And they know that when they're caught, again, going back to our discussion last episode about asylum, they're saying, we can't go back. I can't go back for fear of my life for these reasons. And that's when they're placed in those temporary shelters that everyone heard about on the news. And there's a lot of argument of, how the immigrants were treated in those shelters, but we're not going to spend any time on that. But what happens is when they're in the shelters, they're assigned a caseworker. And that caseworker then works with the immigrant to kind of begin their asylum process. And if you're an unaccompanied minor, part of that caseworker's job is to look for what's called a sponsor. And a sponsor can be anybody. It can be someone who's documented, someone who's undocumented. It could be a family member, it could be a friend. But essentially, these minors come with the information of who they're supposed to join when they get to the States, and they turn that over to the caseworker. And they hope that through their journey that the wrong people don't get their hands on that information, because then you get kind of the story that we talked about last episode as well with the guy and his wife and bad people using that for bad means. So the sponsor is found, and they have to fill out a packet, and I've helped numerous families fill these things out, and they're very simple. They're not that in depth. Then they have to get a background check. Background check is a pretty simple one. And then once everything, the caseworker says, yes, that sponsor's legit. Yes, we're good to go. All the paperwork's filled out. Then travel arrangements are made. The government doesn't pay for those travel arrangements. So what happens is the family is given a phone number to call, and it's a certain travel agency or department. I'm not really sure what. But anyway, you call it with the information of the minor, individual, and you end up buying 2 plane tickets. You buy one for the minor, and you buy one for the caseworker. So you, as the sponsor, are footing the bill for that travel. And then unlike a refugee who's placed in a very particular place by the government, these asylum seekers and these unaccompanied minors are basically going wherever they would like to go. And then once they arrive, and I've been a couple times to the airport picking up unaccompanied minors, they arrive, you wait for them, they show up, the sponsor signs some papers, caseworker returns, off you go. They're here. That's all. That's it. Then there's supposed to be monitoring done by the caseworker, and typically that should be for at least 30 days, but you know, a lot of times that doesn't necessarily happen. And so what you have, and you can see some visuals on the screen, is some of the unaccompanied minors being picked up at the airport, being met by their family members. And you can also see a visual of what the packet looked like that was being filled out. Right. So once the minor's here, they have to be enrolled in school. And that is, we talked in our education episode how that might be a little bit of a surprise because maybe they had finished school where they were due to their age and the structure down there. But yeah, they have to, at least until they're 18, attend the local schools. And you know, they're not really supposed to be working, but most of them do, which is a potential red flag for labor trafficking. I think labor trafficking is a bigger issue with our Guatemalan community than sex trafficking for sure, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's say it's a very similar process, even if you're not an unaccompanied minor. It's a similar process for, say, a family when they arrive declaring asylum. It's a very similar thing. And so whenever they arrive in the community that they're supposed to be in, they're having to look for a job on their own. You know, they're networking with their family and their friends to find that job. They don't have a caseworker to help them find that job. And for the minor, it's the sponsor's responsibility to enroll them in school. The caseworker's not going to do that. And I'd say 99% of them want a job. That's why they're here. So they go and they find one. For sure. And they start working. And through all this, if we're caught by immigration and declare an asylum, they have papers that say they're allowed to be in the States until their case is determined. So going back to undocumented, they could still be labeled as undocumented because of the way that they came. Right. However, they do have documents from the U.S. that says you are allowed to be here. And they have to report to court once a month. Our only immigration court is in Cleveland for the state of Ohio. So thankfully, we're not terribly far away. Not too far, yeah. We're not like in Cincinnati or somewhere. Right. But so they'll have to go up, do a check-in at least once a month in Cleveland, and students will be missing school. It's typically for that. Adults might have to miss work. Yeah. And some of them might have an ankle monitor on for a period of time to make sure like they're not trying to go anywhere else. And so that's kind of what it looks like. Like they are being kept track of. The families then are responsible for finding their own immigration attorney. So unlike typical law in the States or criminal law, you don't have the right to an attorney in an immigration case. No. You are having to pay your own bill or represent yourself. Yeah. So for our families, there's numerous private, for-profit attorneys that they will use. Yeah. And then we also have a pretty big nonprofit located in Canton that a lot of families will go to called Centro San Jose or IWP, Immigrant Worker Project, the English. So they will then begin to try to piece together the case to try and win this case. That case can typically take anywhere from 1 year to 5 years. And during that time, they're allowed to be here. And think about like, you're here for that period of time, then maybe you start that the process is taking longer than it should. Then you start to kind of put down roots and, you know, life kind of takes its course, or you start missing family members. and then maybe they come up to join you, or maybe you just, yeah. But before we get into any more details of that, just a brief excerpt of history. So I just thought it was interesting because people always talk about, come the right way, or my ancestors came in this fashion. Mm-hmm. I would encourage those people to look at what immigration history was and what it was like during the Ellis Island years or pre-Ellis Island years. What was immigration like on the West Coast? Because to come the right way back then was actually pretty simple. Mm-hmm. You showed up at Ellis Island. You went through several physical exams, which today are very outdated. Some of the things they might not let people in for are kind of goofy. But yes. At any rate, if you passed the medical exam, you were then documented and allowed to move into the U.S. and continue living in the U.S. so long as you weren't a menace to society. So to go along with what immigration was like back in the day, there is an article in the Boston Globe from September 6, 1884. And this is two girls, 9 and 10 years old, Maggie and Mary Slingsby from Ireland. Mm-hmm. They traveled on their own together to reunite with their parents in the United States. So they traveled across in a ship. It said they had their names painted on heavy cardboard signs with green ribbons that were on their body. And they were planning to reunite with their parents who lived where? Ohio. So these two little unaccompanied minors arrived in the U.S. with nothing but their names, saying who they were supposed to be with when they got here. Mm-hmm. And this is back in 1884. And it's Irish immigrants living in Cleveland. They were finally able to send for their children. And the children were staying with grandparents back in Ireland. Yeah. Same with our unaccompanied minors, majority. They're staying with grandparents or other family members in Guatemala. So just to show you, history is important. Yes. History repeats itself. There is a long line. Everything's connected. Things just don't come out of the blue. And then the other story, fast forwarding to Ellis Island, because this predated Ellis Island. Yeah. Once Ellis Island was in effect, the very first immigrant to set foot on Ellis Island was an unaccompanied girl and her little brother. And there's actually a statue, for any of you who have been to Ellis Island, there's a statue of that girl representing the first immigrant to go through Ellis Island, was an unaccompanied minor. So fast forwarding here to what happens if you do get caught at the border and you do get sent back for whatever reason. Well, Guatemala, they do have the Ministry of Social Welfare that was supposed to meet with the families or the minors or whoever gets deported back to Guatemala. They will meet them there, and then they will try to put up medical screenings and psychological support for those families. I don't know a whole lot about what that looks like, but that is what the Guatemalan government says they have. I haven't talked to any families that have been deported that can confirm or deny what that looks like. But that's what's out there. That's according to the Migrant Policy Institute. So I mentioned briefly labor trafficking. Human trafficking. We think of Liam Neeson and his really cool phone call trying to save his daughter. But that's not how human trafficking really looks. Certainly not in our community. Right. Sex trafficking is out there. I encourage you to contact Tusk Against Trafficking if you want more information. Yeah. But for our Guatemalan families, like I said, labor trafficking, you can see some red flags here. I'll go ahead and read them for our listeners. But red flags for labor trafficking might be family relationships are not clear. The child may not be the biological child of the parent in the home. Yes. Quote unquote parent. So there's no evidence of a legal guardian. Might work for an aunt or an uncle. They're physically exhausted. They work long hours. They're fearful for their family that they live with. Maybe the child is responsible for childcare, cleaning, hidden chores. So this is from the Summit Victim Assistance Academy and these red flags. Now, when you go through those or you listen to those, you think, well, an unaccompanied minor, especially anybody who's worked around unaccompanied minors, maybe people in schools, you're like, well, good grief. Like, they could probably...
That's a lot of my students.
That's
is what you think. Yeah.
Yeah. But...
some of those factors
right.
are legit. Yes.
They could be legit, but it doesn't mean that they're being labor trafficked.
Correct.
It just means
Yeah.
be aware.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of what's the airport slogan, see something, say something.
Yeah.
You know, just be aware, be a good listener. Because in the end, like we talked about, they probably are working. They are probably staying with an aunt or an uncle, but again, it doesn't mean it's anything malevolent.
Right.
All right. So I want to go over just quickly 2 types of visas, not super in depth, but these are visas. So we said you need a visa to get into the States if you come that way. But then there's 2 types of visas that you can actually get after you've been here. And talking about human trafficking, you can qualify if you are found to be a victim of human trafficking, a T visa for human trafficking. And there's certain things that you have to meet by that, and it has to go through a whole court process. If those of you listening, if you're interested in learning more about the T visa, it's literally the letter T, then visa, T for trafficking. Feel free to look that up on your own time. And then the U visa being the letter U. And the U visa is for victims of qualifying crimes, certain family members. So like if your child is a victim of these crimes and you are the guardian, you can also qualify for this U visa. It allows certain protections for a period of time, so long as the local law enforcement signs off on it. But even so, this process can take up to 4 years to be granted a U visa. And during that time, your immigration case can still play out and you can still be eventually denied your case, even if you still have this U visa in process, which is crazy.
That is crazy. You would think it would override it, but not necessarily.
Yeah, but the USCIS, which is the United States, basically citizenship, immigration, they have a huge backlog of these U visas. We have had a couple local families get their U visas, but it's one of those things that's out there for families that are victims of crime, domestic abuse, etc. But it's a difficult process to get there. And as I mentioned earlier, our only immigration court is in Cleveland. And at the time of this, there was only 6 immigration judges for the state of Ohio.
Yeah.
So no wonder there's a backlog, right? So yeah, the average length, they're trying to find more judges, more ways to push them through and get their cases heard. But it's been a process. It still really hasn't picked up that much. And so post-coronavirus, we were talking about Julio and his journey and getting to the States. And so, again, that walk in empathy, regardless of kind of where you stand on things, just look at the coronavirus epidemic, right? Kind of the chaos that caused. And there's this quote here: if the coronavirus has taught us anything, it is the lengths that people will go to when they're desperate, or when they feel that they're desperate. So the next time you want to judge boat people or refugees or migrants fleeing a war-torn land, remember we fought over toilet paper, right? And I think that's what people forget, is we can project our moral standing onto people based off where we are in life currently, whether it's a criminal, or an immigrant, or any sort of other negative label on a person.
Right.
But when we look at silly things like what we do with toilet paper, or maybe there's a major storm coming, we will do anything to protect our families. we don't care what might be polite or impolite necessarily in moments where our families' lives are in danger or perceived to be in danger. So I remember just another quick story. I was in Guatemala. I was in a little small house in the town of Neiva, and I was eating with a family, and they had the news up on this little TV, and it was their national news, and a U.S. senator came on. Okay. They were just showing a clip of it, and obviously it was dubbed over in Spanish. But the senator was saying on the news that we are going to make it a felony, or we're going to increase the penalty for anybody who comes illegally to the United States. And we believe that this is going to make a difference in deterring families. Okay. And I remember I looked across at the guy, like the uncle, and I'm like, really? and we both kind of chuckled because we know that the people that were coming up through couldn't care less about things like that. They're worried about, can my family eat? Can I make a living? Can my kid get an education? Can I set my family up? Again, right or wrong, you might agree or disagree with that.
Right.
But that's their mindset. They're not coming from our middle class American mindset. Right. They're coming from their survival mode. So right or wrong, we just got to remember where their mindset is for that. Yeah. DACA. Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So DACA, this was in the news, not so much recently, but in the past.
Yeah, it definitely feels like something of the past.
Yeah, you don't really hear about it as much anymore. But what DACA means is it basically, for those students, I referenced a couple of the students that may have been brought here when they were 3 or 4 years old, went to school here their entire life. Yeah. DACA would be for them. They could apply for DACA to where they would be able to go to college in the United States. Yes. DACA, just debunk some things here, just the main points. DACA does not provide citizenship. No. It is not a pathway to citizenship. So when we hear, pathway to citizenship, what does that mean? Pathway to citizenship means whatever you're doing is one step closer to becoming a U.S. citizen.
It's getting you there.
It's getting you there. So DACA, anything like that, that is not a pathway. If you get DACA, you're not any closer to getting U.S. citizenship than you were before. Right. Again, I encourage you to look up. It's on the screen for those of you watching, but look that up. Look at the qualifications. It's very hard. Like, you don't need an attorney to fill that stuff out, but you do, because it's very complicated to do it right, and you have to meet a certain specifications. But yeah, it's something that I think was misunderstood. An example of a pathway to citizenship would be permanent residency. Like that permanent residency is a step in the direction of becoming a citizen. So that's the example. Yeah. So sanctuary cities. I'm going to play a video here. You can watch or listen. And sanctuary cities, this is a hot one in the news still today. Yes. And it's something very misunderstood. So I'm going to go ahead and play that.
When we think about sanctuary cities, we tend to imagine, depending on our political view, either lawless cesspools where federal law is utterly ignored.
Pretty much the definition of anarchy.
Human sacrifices, rapes, murders.
Satan worshipers. American lives are being lost.
They are breaking the law. They are harboring fugitives. This is absolutely nuts.
Or havens for one of the nation's most marginalized groups.
You are safe in Chicago.
This is about human beings, families.
And we will continue to be a place of refuge.
But in reality, neither of those descriptions quite fit. And to understand why, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a local police officer. First, what are sanctuary cities? They're cities and counties in the U.S. that limit their cooperation with immigration enforcement, which falls under federal jurisdiction. These policies are different in different places. In Chicago, it means city employees aren't supposed to share residence immigration status with other people. In Washington, D.C., it means police officers are barred from asking residents about their immigration status. But often, it comes down to this. How does a local police officer handle an unauthorized immigrant that he's already arrested for some other reason? Let's say a cop pulls someone over for speeding. The cop notices this person has an unpaid speeding ticket, and they miss their day in court. So the cop arrests the person, books them into the local jail. While they wait for someone to post bail, the person gets fingerprinted. That's part of the booking process. Those fingerprints then get sent to an FBI database, and then a database kept by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. That step is mandatory. Whether or not a city calls itself a sanctuary city, it still has to send those fingerprints through the FBI database. If the fingerprints match up with someone who ICE knows is an unauthorized immigrant, they might send the local cops holding this person something called a detainer request. The detainer request is just that. It's a request. The federal government is asking, not demanding, that police hold that person for an extra 48 hours after they would normally be released. That gives ICE time to come by, pick them up, start the deportation process. Now, ICE can't force local law enforcement to hold someone just by sending one of these detainer requests. The Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibits state governments from having to enforce federal law, and some federal courts have decided that detainer requests fall into that category. So, if you're a local police chief or sheriff and you get one of these requests, you have a choice. Do you honor the request or do you let the person go? Let's say you honor the request, keep the person in jail for an extra 48 hours. ICE comes to pick them up, and they get deported. Word gets out around the immigrant community. Anytime you interact with local police, it could mean deportation. Eventually, immigrants will be afraid to call the police, even when they're the victims of crime or the witnesses to it. And then immigrants become easy targets.
Because the bad guys know that many immigrants will not call the police.
For a local police chief, this is a big problem. It's impossible to do their jobs when they don't have people's trust.
500,000 Angelenos, people that live in Los Angeles, are undocumented immigrants. I need their cooperation. I need them to work with their local police stations. I need them to be witnesses to violent crime.
What about the other option? What happens if you ignore the order and let this person go home? First, there's no guarantee that they won't get deported anyway. Whether a city considers itself a sanctuary or not, local law enforcement can't stop ICE from deporting someone. But there's another problem. Think of the levels of government like rungs on a ladder. You have the federal government at the top level, that includes agencies like ICE. You have the state government, governors, legislatures in the middle. And then at the bottom, you have local government, mayors, police chiefs, sheriffs. If the federal government issues a detainer request and the local police department refuses to accept it, the state government can step in by taking away one of the state funding streams from the local police. That's what happened in Texas in 2017.
The governor of the great state of Texas, Greg Abbott, has declared he will sign a law banning sanctuary cities. He's already issued an order that cuts funding to those sanctuary cities.
This is dangerous, and I will not allow it as governor of Texas.
This map shows the counties in red that always cooperate with ICE and the ones that don't. Those are in orange, yellow, and green. The green counties have the most restrictions on when they cooperate with ICE detainer requests. In late January 2017, shortly after he got into office, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that opens the door to withholding federal funds from sanctuary cities or counties. The wording of that order is vague, and it's already being challenged in federal court. But if Trump's plan does move forward, it could put local law enforcement officers across the country in a lose-lose situation. For them, deciding whether to honor a detainer request is often about choosing between financial security on one hand and public safety on the other.
All right, so as you can see, sanctuary cities don't mean that if you're a sanctuary city, it doesn't mean that you protect illegal immigrants if they commit a crime. Mm-hmm. Not at all. No. It's just as simple as holding them the extra 48 hours. Yeah. So, yeah. All right. So again, anything you hear in the news, both, Democrat, Republican, please just really dive into the research, look into it. I know it's time consuming, but if you're not willing to look into it and have an educated opinion other than just listening, even to us, listen, if you disagree with something that we're saying, please, we encourage you to do your own research and look into it, because that's what this is all about. This is a very complicated issue, and
it's very complex and always changing.
So don't just take anyone's word for it. Like, really take the time to look into it. If you're not willing to take the time to look into it, then don't go spewing inaccurate things, because that's only going to make things worse for everybody, right? All right. So with that, again, just disclaimer, Don and I are not immigration attorneys. Obviously, we just kind of talked about some generalities. If you have any questions about immigration, our contact info is linked to these episodes. And obviously, if it's a question that we can't answer, we do know several immigration attorneys that we'd be happy to connect you with that could answer your questions. So until next time.